People are often taught that healing will make an empath gentler, more agreeable, quicker to forgive, as if, after all the wounds, the reward awaiting them is a return to being softer and safer with the world. But the truth is different. When an empath truly heals, they do not become kinder in the eyes of a narcissist, they become dangerous. Not because they attack, not because they seek revenge, but because they no longer stand in a position where they can be used. Carl Jung once noted that what unsettles people most is not being opposed, but being seen through in silence, when one no longer controls the story about oneself. And the narcissist is a structure that lives entirely off that reflection. When the empath is not yet healed, they function like a mirror, always ready to absorb everything, taking in anger, decoding coldness, rationalizing the indefensible, dimming themselves so the relationship does not collapse. But when the empath heals, what falls away is not compassion, it is the costume of the role they played, the bearer, the rescuer, the one who stays to patch cracks they did not create. And that moment is like removing the final support from a rotting structure. No explosion, no drama, only a heavy silence signaling that the system can no longer stand on its own. The narcissist does not panic because you are stronger than them, but because you are no longer there to keep their illusion running. You no longer argue to prove yourself right, no longer explain to be understood, no longer sacrifice to be allowed to stay. You step back, carrying the calm of someone who has seen the whole picture, and that withdrawal is what ends the game. This video is not about how to defeat a narcissist, because when you have truly healed, you no longer need to defeat anyone. It is about why, to a narcissist, the most frightening thing is not your anger, but the moment you become irrelevant, like a door closing very softly, yet shutting down an entire world that once survived on your presence. To understand why a healed empath becomes dangerous to a narcissist, we first need to understand why an unhealed empath is treated the worst by the narcissist, despite being the one who loves the deepest, endures the most, and sacrifices the most. The reason is very simple, yet very cruel. They are too predictable. Carl Jung once described that an inflated ego is not afraid of kindness. It is afraid of what it cannot control. And the unhealed empath, with all their empathy, tolerance, and desire to preserve connection, is the most controllable structure of all. They always look for reasons to excuse harmful behavior. Always believe that if they understand deeply enough, love enough, endure long enough, things will change, and that very belief turns them into a stable component within a manipulative system. To the narcissist, the unhealed empath functions like a safety buffer. Every outburst of anger is absorbed. Every cold withdrawal is interpreted by the empath as they are in pain. Every act of devaluation is translated into, "I am not good enough." There is no need for force or threats. The narcissist only needs to withdraw at the right moment, offer hope in the right dose, and disappear at the right time. The empath will self-adjust, self-doubt, and remain. In this structure, the empath is not an opponent. They are an external emotional regulation mechanism for the narcissist. That is why, as long as the empath lives within the logic of, if I love correctly enough, the other person will change, the narcissist feels no danger at all. They see someone who always reacts, always returns, always needs explanations, always seeks closure, and wherever there is a need to be understood, the narcissist holds power. Unhealed empaths often confuse empathy with responsibility, love with rescue, patience with self-erasure. They stay not because they are valued, but because they fear that if they leave, everything will collapse, not only the relationship, but also their self-image as the good one, the understanding one, the one who can endure. What the narcissist needs is not the empath's love, but the empath's continuous emotional participation. They need you to react, to confirm their existence, need you to hurt to feel powerful, need you to explain so they can keep the narrative in their favor. And as long as the empath believes that withdrawing is selfish, that silence is cruel, that setting boundaries means hurting others, the narcissist remains safe. Nothing in that structure threatens them. Therefore, the danger does not come from the empath loving less or becoming colder. It appears only when the empath no longer needs to stay to prove they are a good person. When the empath stops measuring worth by endurance, stops defining identity by saving others, stops treating their pain as the price of love, then, and only then, does the narcissist begin to feel unsettled. Because a system that once ran smoothly on the empath's self-sacrifice is now confronted with something it has no tools to handle: non-participation. The empath's awakening does not occur in a single radiant moment. It unfolds as a series of quiet shifts, each stage requiring the relinquishment of an old identity in order to move closer to their true self. The first stage often begins with a profound exhaustion, not the kind that sleep can fix, but an existential fatigue, when the empath realizes that no matter how much they understand, how long they endure, how deeply they love, the pattern repeats exactly the same. At this stage, they have not yet resisted or left, but internally, a question dangerous to the old system begins to surface. Why am I always the one carrying this? This is when the empath starts to feel estranged from themselves, because the very traits they once took pride in, endurance, understanding, sacrifice, have become sources of pain. According to Carl Jung, this is the moment when the unconscious begins pushing repressed truths to the surface. And although the empath may still remain, they are no longer staying with the same naive belief as before. The second stage is disillusionment, often triggered by a betrayal, a moment of being replaced, or simply an act clear enough that self-deception can no longer continue. This is no longer exhaustion. It is a direct collision with illusion. The empath realizes they were not loved for who they truly were, but for a function, the function of soothing, buffering, mirroring, and absorbing. The most painful loss at this stage is not the relationship itself, but the loss of the self-image of being the chosen one, the special one, the one who can heal. The empath begins to see clearly that their empathy has been used as a resource, and for the first time in their life, they no longer have the energy to justify it. This is the moment when the empath's shadow begins to knock those parts, once labeled selfish, cold, or uncaring, now emerge not to destroy, but to protect. The third stage is conscious withdrawal, and this is where many people around them begin to feel confused. The empath no longer explains, no longer argues, no longer tries to be understood. Their silence is not born of fear, but of clarity. Energy that once flowed outward now turns inward, accompanied by a restructuring of the ego. They begin to set boundaries without apologizing, say no without justification, leave without needing to play the villain or the hero. For narcissists and systems that feed on emotional reactions, this stage is deeply uncomfortable because the empath no longer provides manipulable data. But for the empath themselves, this is the first time they experience something entirely new: quiet without guilt. The final stage is integration, where the empath no longer defines themselves by the role of empath. They do not become unfeeling, but they no longer practice blind empathy. They can feel without being pulled in, understand without rescuing, love without erasing themselves. Shadow and light no longer oppose each other. They stand side by side as two aspects of a mature consciousness. This is when the empath becomes dangerous in the eyes of the narcissist, not because they are stronger, but because they are no longer usable. They do not need to win, prove, or be validated. They only need to live in alignment with their inner truth, and that alone is enough for all power games to collapse. When the empath has passed through these stages of awakening, and entered integration, a strange phenomenon begins to appear. Externally, everything seems unchanged, but internally, the power order has completely reversed. The narcissist still says the same familiar words, uses the same familiar looks, tests the same old strategies with the precision that once worked, but this time the responses no longer lock in, not because the empath resists more forcefully, but because their nervous system is no longer synchronized with the manipulative system. Emotions are no longer triggered at the expected points. Guilt no longer hits its target. Hope no longer activates on cue. And this creates a kind of interference the narcissist cannot name. At a deeper level, what unsettles the narcissist is not whether the empath stays or leaves, but that the empath no longer reacts in the familiar rhythm. In manipulative structures, power does not come from controlling behavior, but from predicting reactions. When reactions become neutral, delayed, or entirely absent, the narcissist becomes disoriented. They no longer know their position in the relationship, no longer know what move will produce which effect, and worst of all, they can no longer feel themselves through the other person. This panic does not erupt immediately. It simmers, stretches over time, and manifests through increasingly fragmented and inconsistent behaviors, as if they are knocking on a door behind which no one is standing anymore. For the integrated empath, this is the phase in which a very quiet yet absolute truth becomes clear. They do not need to do anything to deal with the narcissist. No explaining, no clarifying, no exposing. They simply continue living in their new inner state, where boundaries are no longer defensive actions, but natural consequences of self-awareness. The empath is not trying to appear strong, nor to prove they have awakened. They simply no longer have space for interactions that distort their internal rhythm. And it is precisely this normalization of a non-reactive state that destabilizes the narcissist, because one cannot attack what does not participate in the battle. At an even deeper level, this shift creates a structural change. The empath is no longer a central character in the narcissist's story. They become an unfillable absence, a blind spot in a system that once functioned smoothly because of their presence. The narcissist may find new supply, construct new narratives, even rebuild a new image, but the sense of fit that has been lost cannot be replicated. And this explains why, in silence, the empath remains in the narcissist's mind longer than anyone else, not because of love, but because a structural role has disappeared without a replacement. From the empath side, this is also the first time they understand that freedom does not come from being loved correctly, but from no longer existing within systems that require their pain in order to function. They do not become cold nor closed off. They become clear. And that clarity forces every remaining relationship to self-adjust, either evolve to align with the new truth or quietly fall away without the need for a formal goodbye. This is not the end of the empath's journey, but the beginning of a different life, one in which they no longer live to react, but to be present. And that presence, quiet and undramatic, is the final end to every game that once depended on their sacrifice. There is a paradox that very few people notice when observing narcissistic behavior after a breakup. They may move on quickly, replace efficiently, appear beside someone new with a flawless smile and a story that seems closed, but beneath the surface, something never truly leaves. The narcissist does not miss the integrated empath in the emotional sense of longing. They cannot forget, because what was lost was not a person, but a structural function within their own psychological system. To understand this, one must separate two concepts the narcissist often conflates: replacement and restoration. New supply is merely a temporary behavioral replacement, while the integrated empath once occupied a far deeper structural role, one that no one else can replicate. The narcissist does not seek you because they love you. They lost you because they needed you to feel that they existed. And when that structure is removed, all other supply serves only as temporary scaffolding for an unfillable void. The integrated empath once did something they themselves did not realize. They regulated the narcissist's ego from the outside. During the years trapped in the old loop, the empath reacted, explained, endured, argued, forgave, and that very chain of reactions allowed the narcissist to maintain a sense of self. Each emotional response from the empath acted as a confirmation signal: I still have influence. I am still central. I still exist in someone else's mind. When the empath integrates and withdraws, it is not the relationship that collapses first, but the narcissist's self-regulation mechanism that is dismantled. New supply cannot replace this because there is no shared history. There is no unconscious attunement. The narcissist may receive admiration, attention, even worship from someone new, but what they do not receive is precise reflection. The integrated empath once saw the narcissist in both light and shadow, reacted at exactly the most sensitive points, touched layers the new person has never reached. When that function disappears, the narcissist does not just lose a person, they lose the inner map they once used to locate themselves. This is why narcissists can be with new supply, yet continue comparing, quietly checking, being pulled back toward memories that carry no specific emotion but remain stubbornly persistent. This is not nostalgia, but chronic misalignment. Every reaction from the new person is almost right, but never exact, not deep enough, not familiar enough, not timed correctly. And this misalignment creates a background tension that the narcissist cannot resolve through external behavior alone. Moreover, the integrated empath carries something profoundly uncomfortable for the narcissist: the trace of truth. Not truth that is spoken, but truth that has been withdrawn from the system. When the empath no longer reacts, no longer tries to prove anything, no longer needs to be understood, they unintentionally leave behind an emptiness where the narcissist is forced to face themselves or continue fleeing. New supply helps them flee, but it cannot erase the truth that there was once someone who saw the whole picture and still withdrew. This creates a crack that cannot be repaired through replacement. At a deeper level, the narcissist cannot forget the integrated empath because they cannot rewrite that person's role. The narcissist can rewrite the surface story: the ex was weak. They couldn't handle me. They left because they weren't worthy. But the unconscious does not operate through language. It operates through imprint. And the imprint the integrated empath leaves behind is not an emotion, but a disappearance that cannot be manipulated. This is what obsesses the narcissist most. No reaction to bend, no answer to retrigger, no door to knock on. The more new supply tries to fill the gap, the more visible the absence becomes. The narcissist may intensify activity, posting photos, displaying happiness, building an image of success, but all of these actions share the same unconscious aim: to recover the feeling of being mirrored as before. And because they cannot find it, they are forced to increase the dose, increase stimulation, increase drama, increase control. But the more they increase, the more exhaustion is exposed, because they are trying to use behavior to repair a structural hole. Another reason the narcissist cannot forget the integrated empath is that the role cannot be transferred. New supply can take on the role of admiration, the role of indulgence, even the role of endurance, but they cannot take on the role of the unconscious counterweight. The integrated empath once held a very particular position: close enough to mirror, deep enough to see through, strong enough to stay, and finally awake enough to leave. This combination cannot be replicated because it does not come from personality, but from an inner integration journey others have not undergone. And here is the crucial point. The narcissist is not obsessed with the integrated empath because they lost love, but because they lost a standard. After that standard disappears, every other relationship is measured against its shadow. No one new is truly enough. No one new is truly right. Not because the empath was perfect, but because they once occupied the correct position within the narcissist's psychological system. When that position is empty, the system cannot rebalance itself. From the empath side, what matters to understand is this: the narcissist's inability to forget you is not your victory, and it is not your responsibility. It is simply the natural consequence of withdrawing from a role you were never born to perform. You did not leave a void because you are special, but because you stopped enabling a structure that needs you to hurt in order to exist. And when that structure continues running without a core component, it is forced to operate in a permanently unstable state. Ultimately, the narcissist may keep living, keep loving, keep replacing, but they will no longer experience that same sense of fit as before. The integrated empath becomes an invisible reference point, not because you remain present, but because you withdrew in the right way. No final words, no resistance, no clinging, only the disappearance of a function that once held their inner world upright. And that is why, even with new supply, the narcissist cannot truly forget you, because what was lost was not a person, but a structure they cannot recreate. After the stage of surface-level replacement, a quiet yet steady process begins inside the narcissist, the fracturing of their capacity for self-soothing. When the empath was still there, even within a contradictory relationship, the narcissist still had a familiar anchor to release pressure, test power, and confirm that they still had impact. But when the integrated empath withdraws, that anchor disappears, and the narcissist is forced to rely entirely on external sources that lack depth. At first, they do not recognize this, because behavior still works. They still have someone new, still have attention, still receive responses. But structurally, the system has begun losing its ability to regulate. This explains why narcissists often become restless, irritable, unable to sit still, even when everything seems fine. Not because new supply did something wrong, but because the feedback they receive is no longer sufficient to stabilize the ego. The integrated empath once responded on a very specific level: emotional, cognitive, and mirror-like at the same time. New supply usually provides only one of the three, either emotion, admiration, or submission. This deficit creates a prolonged state of incompleteness, forcing the narcissist to constantly adjust behavior in search of a familiar feeling they cannot name. Over time, this becomes a kind of objectless obsession. The narcissist does not necessarily think about the empath every day, but they compare constantly. This reaction is not the same. That look is not enough. This silence is not in the right place. What they are seeking is not the old person, but the lost fit. And because it cannot be found in the present, their mind begins turning back to the past as a storage of sensation, where things once ran more smoothly. This is when the integrated empath becomes an unconscious reference standard, even if the narcissist never admits it in words. Another consequence appears at the cognitive level. The narcissist begins rewriting the story again and again, but no version is stable enough. When the empath withdraws in silence, without arguing, without clinging, without playing the victim or the villain, the narcissist loses the data needed to complete the narrative. They cannot say, "I discarded them," and they cannot say, "They hurt me," because there is no emotional evidence to support it. This leaves the story in a suspended, unresolved state, and anything unresolved continues to consume psychological energy. At an even deeper level, the absence of the integrated empath activates a very primitive fear in the narcissist. The fear that no one truly sees them anymore. Not being admired, but being seen both light and shadow. The integrated empath was once the only one close enough to see the whole picture, and awake enough to leave without needing to destroy. This leaves behind a deeply uncomfortable imprint. It gives the narcissist an experience they cannot erase, that someone once saw clearly and did not choose to stay. This experience does not produce healthy remorse, but it does create a crack in the illusion of the ego's invulnerability. That is why narcissists often swing between two seemingly contradictory states: performance and retreat. At times they need the world to see them happier than ever. At other times they withdraw into silence, avoiding confrontation, avoiding comparison. Both are attempts to regulate an unstable system. And in all these attempts, the integrated empath remains present as an absence with a clear shape, not because they are still there, but because they once occupied a position no one else can replace. Importantly, this process does not end quickly, nor does it have a clear climax. It stretches on quietly, becoming the background for every relationship the narcissist has afterward. No matter whom they love, where they are, what they do, a baseline sense remains. Something is not the same as before. And that sense does not come from the new person, but from a structural role that has vanished permanently. The narcissist may learn to live with it, but they cannot erase it, because it is tied to the first time their system had to function without the old mirror. Silent hoovering is not a sign of maturity or respect for boundaries. It is the expression of a system that has lost direct access, but has not accepted a structural loss. When the integrated empath withdraws properly, the narcissist can no longer use familiar tools, apologies, blame, drama, playing the victim, because those tools only work when someone remains on the other side, ready to react. Silent hoovering appears precisely when the narcissist realizes that any direct approach carries the risk of exposure, not the risk of rejection, but the risk of being seen through without being allowed into a power dialogue. At a deeper level, silent hoovering is a safety test. Before revealing themselves, the narcissist needs to know one thing: whether the old mirror still works. They do not ask, they do not speak, they do not knock, they watch from afar. A story view, a coincidental appearance in a shared space, a stay-like, an indirect piece of information that is accidentally delivered. All of it is meant to measure the smallest possible reaction: a tremor, curiosity, a change in the empath's nervous system. If a reaction appears, the old system still has hope. If not, the narcissist retreats deeper, not out of respect, but because they sense that direct contact now would expose powerlessness. And precisely at the point where the old structure no longer works, but a new structure has not yet formed, the narcissist falls into a very particular state, unable to move forward, unable to go back. They have lost direct access, yet have not accepted that the absence is permanent. In Jung's view, when an ego is withdrawn from a familiar source of reflection without a dramatic collapse to end the story, the unconscious will seek indirect paths to maintain the illusion of control. From that in-between space, a new form of approach emerges: wordless, non-confrontational, not clear enough to call a return, yet not decisive enough to call letting go. This is when hoovering no longer needs language, because its goal is not dialogue, but to test whether the old mirror still reflects. Silent hoovering is also the consequence of fear of humiliation before the ego itself. When the empath has integrated, they no longer argue, no longer need closure, no longer have the need to talk it out. This makes any direct approach a risk. If it is ignored, met with neutrality, or worse, with irrelevance, the narcissist would have to face what they avoid most: that they no longer have power. So silence becomes a defensive strategy. It preserves the fantasy of control, even if only in imagination. There is an even deeper layer. Silent hoovering is an attempt to reactivate a sensory memory, not a memory of events. The narcissist is not seeking words. They are seeking a state. They hope their vague presence, a trace, a shadow, will awaken the old feeling in the empath. Familiar anxiety, the urge to explain, the impulse to make things calm again. But for the integrated empath, the nervous system no longer registers these signals as before. That difference creates a slip. The narcissist feels they were there, yet caused no impact. They touched, yet received no echo. That slip is what makes silent hoovering stretch and repeat. Silent hoovering also reflects a subtle reversal of power. Before, the narcissist initiated because they were certain there would be a reaction to exploit. Now, direct initiation can produce evidence of powerlessness. Silence allows them to preserve the imagined power of "I still have influence. If I wanted to, I could return." In reality, it is the ego soothing itself when facing the loss of access. Silence is not strength. It is avoidance, wrapped in composure. One important detail. Silent hoovering often increases when the narcissist is in a new relationship. This may sound paradoxical, but it is structurally logical. New supply provides stimulation. The integrated empath once provided fit. When stimulation is no longer enough to stabilize the ego, the narcissist reaches for the memory of that fit, not to return, but to compare unconsciously. Silent hoovering then becomes a way to touch the old reference without disrupting the current image. For the integrated empath, what matters is this: silent hoovering exists only if there is still an expectation that silence will produce an effect. When the empath does not react, does not monitor, does not interpret, does not wonder, silent hoovering gradually becomes hollow and loses motive force. The narcissist may continue to appear for a while, but each time there is no feedback is a time the strategy is neutralized. And this neutralization without drama, without words, is what erodes the illusion of control the fastest. Silent hoovering, therefore, is not an attempt at connection. It is an attempt to delay acceptance, to delay admitting that the old mirror is gone, that the role has disappeared, that access has been withdrawn without a final conversation. In that delay, the narcissist stands between two worlds, no longer able to control the past, not yet stabilized in the present. And this in-between space feeds silent, hoovering, repetitive, ambiguous, wordless, until either they find a replacement structure strong enough, or they are forced to accept that some doors close without making a sound. When silent hoovering creates no ripple at all, a truth begins to seep into the narcissist system in an unbearable way. The old mirror has truly stopped reflecting, not temporarily, not due to misunderstanding, but because the empath has fully withdrawn from the role. In Jung's view, this is the moment the unconscious is forced to update reality, and when that update cannot happen smoothly, the ego will seek a new strategy to preserve the felt sense of existence. The failure of silent hoovering does not end the game. It only marks that the narcissist must move into increasingly visible moves. The first strategy that often appears is the recreation of noise. The narcissist begins generating signals ambiguous enough to cause wobble, but safe enough to retreat if needed. They may appear more frequently in shared spaces, make abrupt image changes, spread stories indirectly meant to trigger sensory memory. The goal is not contact, but to break the empath's neutrality. If the integrated empath still does not react, this strategy quickly loses effect, and the narcissist feels more clearly than ever that they are striking into emptiness. When noise stops working, the narcissist often shifts to reconstructing the narrative. This is the stage where they need a new story to protect the ego from helplessness. The empath is assigned new labels: cold, arrogant, changed, ungrateful, not to persuade the empath to return, but to persuade the narcissist that power has not been lost. Yet, because the empath does not participate in correcting the story, the narrative always lacks half the necessary data. It exists, but it is unstable. And each time it is repeated without mirrored feedback, instability increases. The next step often escalates further: indirect hoovering through third parties. The narcissist tries to appear in unrelated conversations, to have their name accidentally mentioned, to have their presence felt without direct confrontation. This is a final attempt to test whether the empath can still be pulled into the old emotional field. But with the integrated empath, these signals are no longer processed emotionally, but cognitively. And when cognition has replaced reflex, this strategy also quickly reveals its emptiness. When silent hoovering, noise, narrative, and intermediaries all fail, the narcissist often arrives at a critical fork, either public smearing or complete withdrawal to rebuild the ego elsewhere. Smearing is the last attempt to force the empath back by provoking self-defense, explanation, the need to set the record straight. But if the empath remains non-participatory, smearing loses its controlling effect and becomes only a monologue. Withdrawal, in this case, is not acceptance, but the freezing of the experience. The narcissist carries the imprint of that failure into other relationships without ever processing it. What must be seen is this. Every new strategy the narcissist deploys after silent hoovering fails is less effective than the one before, because it moves farther from true reflection. Not because the narcissist becomes weaker, but because the access point has been locked. And when there is no access, all behavior becomes self-soothing rather than control. This shift from control to self-soothing is the clearest sign that the old system cannot be restored. When even the final strategies run out of effectiveness, a very subtle change occurs inside the narcissist, not loud, not dramatic, but decisive. It is the moment they stop trying to pull the empath back, not because they have let go, but because the unconscious begins to understand that this absence is no longer a move within the game. In Jung's view, when a defensive system tries every familiar path and produces no feedback, it is forced to face a new reality, not through clear insight, but through existential fatigue. At this stage, the narcissist is no longer active in the old sense. They still live, still appear, still operate other relationships, but underneath is a quiet adjustment, avoiding situations that might trigger comparison, avoiding connections deep enough to mirror, avoiding people who are not easily manipulated. Not because a moral lesson has been learned, but because their system cannot endure another confrontation with an unresponsive void. This is when power does not collapse, it contracts. Alongside that contraction, the integrated empath enters a very different state, not a state of victory, but a state of no longer needing to win. When there is no Hoover to react to, no narrative to correct, no role to refuse, the empath's inner life begins stabilizing in a new way. Not euphoric, but grounded. Not cold, but clear. They realize this peace does not come from the narcissist stopping. It comes from having left the old field. From here, a gentle truth becomes visible. The narcissist does not disappear from the empath's world. They disappear from the center. No longer an object to understand, analyze, or guard against. Only a part of the past placed in its proper position. And when the position is right, energy is no longer pulled backward. Silence is no longer a defensive tactic. It becomes the natural state of a system that now self-regulates. This is also when the most important question quietly changes form. It is no longer, why did they do that? Why can't they forget? Or will they come back? Instead, another question appears quieter, but deeper. Why did I once stay in a system that required my pain in order to function? And when that question arises, the narcissist's role in the journey is complete, not as winner or loser, but as a catalyst for an irreversible inner restructuring. From this point onward, everything stops revolving around the narcissist's behavior. The story begins shifting toward inner sovereignty, where the empath does not need silence to protect themselves, but is silent because there is nothing left to react to. And precisely at that thin boundary between no longer being pulled back and no longer needing to prove anything, a conclusion can appear naturally, not as an ending, but as the closing of a completed cycle. Ultimately, what matters most is not what the narcissist did, how they hoovered, or which strategy they switched to when every door was closed. Those questions were once necessary for you to understand what kind of system you were inside. But once this cycle is complete, they no longer hold the central place. Because what truly happened did not lie in the other person's behavioral changes, but in the shift of your inner anchor. When an empath finishes integrating, they are not stronger in the ordinary sense, nor do they become invulnerable like armor. They simply are no longer positioned in the right place to be manipulated. And it is precisely this slight misalignment, so light, so quiet, that renders every external strategy ineffective. No confrontation is needed. No proving is needed. No dramatic withdrawal is needed. Only the withdrawal of a role from a system that once operated on their silent self-sacrifice. At this point, the narcissist may still exist somewhere in your social world, in memory, in old stories, but they are no longer a gravitational pull, no longer an open question, no longer a problem to solve. They become a fact that has been processed not because you have forgotten, but because you have placed it where it belongs. In Carl Jung's view, that is precisely the sign of integration, when an experience no longer governs present behavior, even though its memory remains intact. And perhaps this is the quietest truth of the entire journey. The narcissist is not truly defeated, nor truly abandoned. What ends is the unconscious bond, the place where you once lived to react, to regulate, to keep an unhealthy structure functioning. When that bond dissolves, no formal declaration is needed, because the system simply no longer has the energy to run. The integrated empath does not live in a state of vigilance, nor do they need to maintain distance through effort. They are present in a way that makes what does not fit automatically lose its grip. Not because they are above anyone, but because they no longer depend on being seen, being needed, or being validated. And it is right there that inner sovereignty appears not as a title, but as a way of living. In the end, this story is not about the narcissist. They are only the triggering factor. The real center has always been the moment you leave a system that requires you to lose yourself in order to exist, and step into a life where silence is no longer a defense, but the natural expression of an inner world that can finally stand on its own. At that point, there is nothing left to hoover, nothing left to pull back, because no one is standing in the old position anymore. The cycle ends not with the sound of a door closing, but with a very ordinary continuation of a life that has returned to its own true rhythm.